difference between, one person's brainwashed to leave could be another person's liberated to leave. Perhaps Meghan gave Harry what he needed, which was an exit door.
And maybe the confidence to do it.
Yeah. Then may I point out, on the subject of confidence, let's have a look what's happened. Firstly, Spotify, they lost it, and they were even called grifters by an executive. Secondly, Netflix, 100 million of the first contract. The second contract, she's just said, as ever, is going on without it. Then we had the fact that...
In the meantime, they've made a ton of money.
Exactly. So but they've made money, and they've succeeded in one thing, and that is everyone knows who they are, because the word of the brand has spread. That's a fact.
Okay, Richard, you said let's look at the facts. The fact is, Harry said that he wanted to step away from being a working royal since his early 20s. The other fact is, they haven't left the royal family. This is such an inaccuracy. Prince Harry still remains the son of King Charles III. He's still within the royal family, but they are not working royals. So let's look at that for facts. And second of all, let's look at the fact that right now, why has Tom Bower released this particular bit of the book? Because this particular bit of the book is the book that's going to garner the headlines. It's a distractionary tactic. Let's look at what Harry and Meghan are doing, rather than talking about the royal family, rather than talking about the royal family being booed at the Commonwealth Service last week. We're talking about this. In October 2025, I'm still talking. In October 2025, when Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's titles were put into abeyance, there was a fivefold increase in stories about Meghan, and 79% of those stories were negative. This is all about a distractionary tactic. Instead of talking about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and the effect that has on the royal family, we're talking about Harry and Meghan.
There are TV debates, and then there are moments where someone completely flips the script, changes the entire dynamic, and shifts the lens. This was the second one. Because what just happened on live television wasn't just another tired panel discussion about the Sussexes, or everyone repeats the same talking points they've used for years. That was a full-on, slow-motion, methodical dismantling of a narrative that has been recycled so many times it should genuinely qualify for environmental funding at this point. And right at the center of it, Afua Hagan. Cool, composed, prepared, and very clearly not in the mood for nonsense or distractions. Now, let's set the scene properly here, because context matters enormously, even if certain commentators seem allergic to it. You've got the hosts opening up the segment with that classic, tired framing designed to generate heat rather than light. Was Harry brainwashed by Meghan, or was he liberated by their relationship? You can almost hear the producers rubbing their hands together in the background, thrilled with themselves. It's the kind of question specifically designed to stir drama and conflict, not clarity or understanding. But here's the thing, and this is crucial. Hidden inside that seemingly simple question is a truth people keep desperately trying to dance around, trying to avoid acknowledging directly. What if leaving royal duties wasn't manipulation at all? What if it wasn't some dramatic puppet master scenario? What if, instead of this cinematic narrative about control and influence, we're actually looking at a man who had been struggling with royal life, with institutional constraints, with media intrusion for literal decades, and finally chose something different for himself and his family? And just like that, with that simple reframing, the entire storyline starts to wobble. The foundation cracks. Because if Harry had agency, if he made his own choice based on his own experiences, then the whole Meghan brainwashed him narrative collapses completely. Then comes Richard entering the conversation. And listen, at this point, if you've watched any royal panel discussions over the past few years, you could probably predict his talking points in your sleep. Spotify deal criticism, Netflix deal criticism, grifters comment thrown in for effect, repeat endlessly. It's like he's got a greatest hits playlist that he's been performing since 2020 and absolutely refuses to add new tracks or update the material. He jumps into the conversation trying to reframe everything around competence and success, listing what he clearly thinks are failures and missteps by the Sussexes. But notice something genuinely important here in how he operates. He's not actually addressing why Harry and Meghan left royal duties in the first place. He's not engaging with the actual question. He's pivoting immediately to different territory. And that pivot, that deflection, that's everything. Because instead of discussing the decision itself, the actual reasons behind stepping back, the lived experiences that led to that choice, the conversation gets deliberately dragged into contracts, money, business deals, and public perception metrics. It's a distraction dressed up as analysis. It's deflection packaged as commentary, and it's extremely effective at derailing conversations that might get uncomfortable for certain narratives. But then, Afua steps in, and this is where things fundamentally shift, where the dynamic completely changes. No shouting, no theatrics, no emotional appeals, just precision, just facts. She literally says something like, "Okay, you want to talk about facts, let's actually do facts then." That alone should have come with a warning label on screen, because what follows is not the usual back-and-forth fluff or talking point tennis. First major point she drops, Harry had been talking about stepping away from royal life since his early 20s, since before he even met Meghan. Let that sink in for a moment. Really absorb what that means. Not after meeting Meghan and falling in love, not after marriage, not after some imagined turning point or moment of influence. We're talking years before, a decade plus of expressing the same desires, the same concerns, the same questions about whether this life was sustainable for him and his family. And just like that, with that simple reframing, the entire storyline starts to wobble, the foundation cracks. Because if Harry had agency, if he made his own choice based on his own experiences, then the whole Meghan brainwashed him narrative collapses completely. Then comes Richard entering the conversation. And listen, at this point, if you've watched any royal panel discussions over the past few years, you could probably predict his talking points in your sleep. Spotify deal criticism, Netflix deal criticism, grifters comment thrown in for effect, repeat endlessly. It's like he's got a greatest hits playlist that he's been performing since 2020 and absolutely refuses to add new tracks or update the material. He jumps into the conversation trying to reframe everything around competence and success, listing what he clearly thinks are failures and missteps by the Sussexes. But notice something genuinely important here in how he operates. He's not actually addressing why Harry and Meghan left royal duties in the first place. He's not engaging with the actual question. He's pivoting immediately to different territory. And that pivot, that deflection, that's everything. Because instead of discussing the decision itself, the actual reasons behind stepping back, the lived experiences that led to that choice, the conversation gets deliberately dragged into contracts, money, business deals, and public perception metrics. It's a distraction dressed up as analysis. It's deflection packaged as commentary, and it's extremely effective at derailing conversations that might get uncomfortable for certain narratives. But then, Afua steps in, and this is where things fundamentally shift, where the dynamic completely changes. No shouting, no theatrics, no emotional appeals, just precision, just facts. She literally says something like, "Okay, you want to talk about facts, let's actually do facts then." That alone should have come with a warning label on screen, because what follows is not the usual back-and-forth fluff or talking point tennis. She puts it right on the table, clearly and directly. Harry has agency. Harry has always had agency. Harry made a choice. That's not a controversial statement. That's basic respect for an adult human being's capacity to make decisions about their own life. Then she moves to the second myth that's been circulating, the one that just refuses to die no matter how many times it gets corrected. They left the royal family. No, they didn't. And the fact that this still needs to be explained in 2026 is honestly exhausting. Harry is still exactly who he was born as, the son of King Charles III. That biological reality doesn't change because of a job title or role adjustment. What changed, and this is crucial, is their working role within the institution. They stepped back from being working royals, from representing the monarchy in official capacity. That's it. That's the change. Not exile, not removal from the family, not some dramatic permanent banishment that people like to imagine for dramatic effect. Just a shift in duties, a change in job description. But somehow, and this is not accidental, this very basic, simple distinction keeps getting deliberately blurred and confused. Because they left everything behind and were banished sounds a lot more dramatic, more scandalous, more worthy of outrage than they changed their job description and moved to California. And drama sells, scandal sells, outrage sells. But Afua isn't here to sell drama or manufacture outrage. She's here to correct misinformation with facts. And then she goes even deeper into uncomfortable territory. She brings up timing, patterns in media coverage, strategic deployment of stories. Now this is where the conversation evolves from surface-level commentary into something much more interesting and significant. She points out something observable, something documented. Certain headlines, certain negative stories about the Sussexes don't just appear randomly scattered throughout the year. They appear at very specific moments, very particular times. Moments when attention needs to be redirected from other royal news. Moments when other controversies are gaining traction. Moments when uncomfortable questions are being asked elsewhere. And suddenly, we're not just talking about Harry and Meghan anymore as isolated individuals. We're talking about media behavior, about patterns, about strategy, about how narratives get constructed and deployed. Because according to what she laid out, backed by actual analysis and research, when certain royal controversies start gaining public traction and threatening the institutional reputation, there's a noticeable, measurable spike in negative stories about Meghan, specifically. And not just any stories, not balanced coverage, not mixed reporting. Negative ones, overwhelmingly negative. 79% negative coverage according to documented analysis. That's not just bias, that's not just individual reporter preferences, that's not random chance. That's consistency. That's pattern, that's coordinated. And consistency like that level of negativity maintained over years, doesn't happen by accident or coincidence. So now the question becomes crucial. Why? Why is the focus so often redirected toward the Sussexes, specifically? Why does the narrative keep circling back to the same targets repeatedly? Why do certain stories dominate at certain strategic times? Afua calls it what it is, what the evidence suggests, a distraction, a deliberate redirection of attention. And this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable for people who prefer the conversation to stay shallow and surface level. Because once you start looking at patterns, once you start documenting when certain stories appear and what they coincide with, you can't unsee them. Once you start asking why certain narratives dominate at certain times, why coverage spikes around particular events, the whole random media coverage idea starts to fall apart completely. It stops looking coincidental. It starts looking strategic. And that's exactly what Afua does masterfully here. She shifts the entire conversation from, are Harry and Meghan successful, to, why are we constantly being told they aren't, and when exactly does that messaging appear most intensely? That's a completely different level of discussion. That's media literacy. That's critical analysis. Meanwhile, Richard is still trying desperately to anchor things back to deals and public perception and commercial success metrics. And here's the deeply ironic part that probably went unnoticed by many viewers.
In the middle of all his criticism, in the middle of his attempt to frame them as failures, he says something that completely undercuts his own argument. He admits, actually acknowledges out loud, that their brand has spread globally, that everyone knows who they are, that they have worldwide recognition, which is the literal opposite of failure. That's the definition of successful branding and platform building. You cannot logically argue that someone is irrelevant, washed up, or unsuccessful while simultaneously acknowledging their global recognition and brand penetration. That's not how logic works. That's not how success metrics work. But there it is, sitting right there in the middle of his critique, a self-contradiction he doesn't seem to notice. And Afua doesn't even need to jump on it aggressively or make a big deal of pointing it out. It just hangs in the air, doing the work for her, undermining his entire argument. Now, let's talk about that moment, the one that probably made people watching sit up straighter. I'm still talking. 3 words. Short, sharp, unapologetic, clear, and weirdly refreshing in the context of these panel discussions. Because how many times have we all seen these debates where voices get talked over constantly, where points get lost in crosstalk, where the loudest person or the most aggressive interrupter wins by default? Not this time, not here. She finishes her thought, she holds the floor, she maintains control of her point, and more importantly, she makes absolutely sure the point lands completely before moving on. Because this wasn't just about defending Harry and Meghan from criticism. There's an important distinction here. It was about correcting the narrative around them, about challenging the foundation the criticism is built on. There's a fundamental difference between those two approaches. Defending is reactive. It responds to accusations as they come. No, that's not true, or actually, they did this. Correcting is proactive. It challenges the foundation, the framing, the assumptions those accusations are built on. It questions the premise itself. And that's exactly what she did throughout this segment. She didn't just say, they're successful, and leave it at that. She said, let's look at the actual facts, the documented timeline, the observable patterns, and the motivations behind what we're constantly being told about them. That's a much harder argument to dismiss casually or wave away, because now you're not just debating subjective opinions or personal feelings about the Sussexes. You're dealing with context, with documentation, with timelines, with pattern analysis. And context is deeply inconvenient for anyone relying on simplified, emotionally charged narratives that don't hold up under scrutiny. So what we just witnessed wasn't just another panel debate about Harry and Meghan. It was a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to discussing them. One approach that leans heavily on repetition, familiar headlines, emotional reactions, and comfortable talking points that have been used for years. And another approach that leans on facts, documented timelines, pattern recognition, and critical thinking about media behavior. And when those two approaches collide directly on live television, the difference becomes very, very obvious to anyone paying attention, because one sounds loud and confident and emotional, and the other sounds grounded, prepared, and factual. Now, here's the bigger picture question that goes beyond this single panel. Why does this matter? Why does any of this matter beyond a few minutes of daytime television that most people will never see? Because conversations like this, even short ones, even on shows that don't have massive audiences, shape perception over time. They influence how millions of people understand a story, understand a situation, understand public figures. And when misinformation or deliberate oversimplification goes unchallenged repeatedly, when it gets repeated over and over without pushback, it becomes accepted as truth. It becomes the default narrative that people believe without questioning. That's how you end up with years of people confidently repeating things that aren't entirely accurate or are missing crucial context. So when someone steps in and says clearly, Actually, let's slow down and look at the documented facts. That matters. Even if it's just for a few minutes. Even if it's on a show that typically thrives on quick takes and heated exchanges rather than depth. Because those moments create cracks in the narrative. They disrupt the smooth repetition of talking points. And once those cracks appear, once people see that there's another way to look at the story, they start asking questions themselves. And once people start asking questions, genuinely asking rather than just consuming what they're told, the conversation changes fundamentally. That's what Afua did here. That's her real achievement in this segment. She didn't just win an argument or score debate points. She shifted the lens. She changed how people watching might think about the story. And that's considerably more powerful than just being right in a debate. Meanwhile, the usual cycle will probably continue spinning. New headlines will appear, new critiques will be published, same talking points will get recycled and repackaged. Because if there's one thing we've learned over these years, it's that certain narratives don't fade easily. They get recycled endlessly, repackaged with slightly different wording, re-released with new covers. But moments like this, moments like Afua's methodical dismantling, they interrupt that cycle. They throw sand in the gears. They remind people that there's more to the story than what's trending on Twitter or appearing in tabloid headlines. And honestly, it's about time we had more of this. Because whether you personally support Harry and Meghan or criticize them or feel completely neutral about them, one thing should be absolutely non-negotiable: accuracy, clarity, context, and a genuine willingness to actually deal with documented facts. Not just the facts that fit a convenient or profitable narrative. All of them. So the next time you see a headline, a clip, or a panel discussion about the Sussexes that feels a little too familiar, a little too recycled, pause. Look a little closer. Ask why this story is appearing now. Ask what it might be distracting from. Ask who benefits from this framing. Because if this clip showed anything clearly, it's that the surface-level conversation is rarely the full story. And sometimes it takes someone like Afua Hagan sitting calmly on a panel saying, "I'm still talking," and then methodically laying out facts and timelines to remind everyone of that fundamental truth. Thanks for watching. If you appreciated Afua's masterclass in dismantling narratives, smash that like button and subscribe for more fact-based analysis. Let's keep demanding accuracy. Until next time, stay critical, stay informed, and keep questioning the narratives you're sold. I'll see you in the next one.